This video is the start of a new chapter in which we will talk about session management. Now, the first thing to understand about session management, and that is something that confused me for a long time, is that a Coldfusion session is different than a user login. A session exists even if the user does not log in, and even if the application does not implement any login mechanism at all. So the first question to ask is, how does a session begin? The answer to that question is very simple. A session begins when a new user requests his first page. When a new user requests a page, and if session management is enabled in the application, Coldfusion tries to relate that specific request to an existing session. If Coldfusion is unable to relate the request to an existing session, it assumes that this particular request is the first one of a new session. In such case, Coldfusion automatically generates two variables that are used as session identifiers. Those variables are called CFID and CFToken. Then Coldfusion runs the onSessionStart method of the application.cfc file if one is defined. Now, how does Coldfusion maintains a session? Do you remember those two variables, CFID and CFToken? Well, those two variables are sent back to the user and are stored as cookies on the client computer. On the next request, those two cookies are sent along with the request to the server. So when the second request hits the server, Coldfusion is able to retrieve those two session identifiers from the request headers and can use those two variables to identify the session this request belongs to. But what happens if the user disables the cookies? In that case, the CFID and the CFToken variables are added to the URL as URL parameters and are passed from page to page in the URL. Now, how does a Coldfusion session ends? The session ends when a timeout is met. That is, if no request hits a particular session for a certain time. When that happens, Coldfusion runs the onSessionEnd method of the application.cfc, if one is defined, of course, and then discards the session along with all the data stored in the session scope. Now, that timeout can be the default timeout specified in the Coldfusion administrator, or it can be a custom timeout that we specify in our application.cfc. Now, how does a Coldfusion session differs from a user login? On the first page requested by a user, a session is automatically created for that user, even if the user does not log into the application. This is made to enable the developer to store some information about a user and about the user session, even if that user is unknown to the application. Take an online store, for example. When you browse an online store, you first put stuff in your shopping cart, and then you proceed to checkout, where you finally identify yourself to the application. It means that when you were browsing the online catalog, the application had to maintain your shopping cart, even though you were not yet logged into the application. Of course, if you set up a login and logout system on your website, the session scope is the perfect place to store the user information, but it is critical to understand that the session scope itself exists way before you decide to store login information in it. Now let's make a quick summary of the Coldfusion persistent scopes. A persistent scope is a scope whose data is maintained across requests. Coldfusion has three main persistent scopes. The first one is the server scope, and the server scope is where data relevant to the whole server is stored. This data is available to every page of every application hosted on that server. The application scope is specific to one particular application. The data stored in the application scope is available to every page of a specific application. Note that the same server can host multiple applications and therefore can have multiple application scopes. The third one is the session scope, and that scope is specific to a user. The data stored in the session scope can be accessed by any request made by a specific user. Note that a single application can have lots of session scopes, one for each user browsing the application. So in this chapter, we will first enable session management. Then we will implement the login and the logout feature of the website. And finally, we will implement resource access control, which is the authorization process that we will talk about later. So let's get started, and in the next video we will enable session management.